So I really enjoyed Destiny's take on a lot of topics because I think he does a really good job of combating right-wing narratives through like logical statements and factually based arguments and showing where the weaknesses lie and where the logical fallacies lie within right-wing arguments. But recently he has been putting forth this idea that we shouldn't have a $15 minimum wage as being proposed by many candidates currently on the Democratic side, and that instead of that we should just have tax subsidies in order to help poor Americans, essentially have a negative tax rate.
Why not let wages set themselves and just address these things using other policies? So say like tax policy or other sorts of subsidies.
You mean in terms of like...
Well, like, so let's say you make under a certain amount of years, you have like EBT cards, or you get assistance, federal assistance for types of housing or whatever. Maybe not as shit as Section 8 is, or something would be reworked with that, or some sort of like negative tax rate, or some like earned income, like reimbursable tax credit, like stuff like that. One of my biggest problems that I have with lefties in general, and sometimes even with general Democrats, is that markets exist, markets are very powerful, and when you do things that like heavily distort markets, really bad stuff that ends up hurting the people we're trying to help can end up happening.
So I think that this take doesn't really take into account a lot of economic literature and arguments that I'm going to run through here that actually show that the $15 minimum wage should be implemented along with these subsidies, and that both in concert are critical in order to both benefit the economy from a capitalistic point of view and also to benefit the poor immensely and raise their standard of living. So the basic logic behind having a minimum wage policy at $15 an hour, a living wage, is to protect low-skilled workers from the rational desires of companies within capitalism. So these companies are going to want to be able to set the minimum wage for low-skilled workers as low as they can while maintaining the workers' standard of living, while allowing them enough to be able to come into work the next day and be able to feed themselves and house themselves and all of this. And then this is contrasted then with the worker, who has very little ability to negotiate a higher wage when they are a low-skilled worker because they have the constant threat of unemployment. Within society, since we do have unemployment, the companies are able to simply replace low-skilled workers very easily. These workers aren't going to be extremely like hard or difficult for companies to replace. So these workers have like the lowest ability out of anyone within our economy to negotiate wages. So when this is taken into consideration, government subsidies allow these companies, without having a living minimum wage in place as federal law, they allow these companies to lower the wage of their workers far below subsistence level and rely on government subsidies in order to make up the difference. So whenever there is no minimum wage, or a minimum wage like we have that is far below what a living minimum wage was, then the government is simply subsidizing these corporations to pay people less and less. And so historically, this has failed dramatically for a number of reasons. But we can look toward England first, where they had a program of government subsidies in the absence of minimum wage and saw catastrophic failures because of it. In the Theory of Practice and Wage Subsidization, Some Historical Reflections, published in the Center for Business Research at the University of Cambridge, they explained that work can be made to pay by working family tax credits, but these might lower wages and price non-recipients out of the market, widening the eligibility for the wage supplementation and raising social welfare bills. This was precisely the effect of the Speenhamland system of wage supplementation of the early 19th century, which permanently affected labor markets and attitudes to welfare and the poor. The possibility of working family tax credits having a similar effect cannot be ruled out. So this results in multiple negative effects for society, because in the absence of a $15 living minimum wage, you see things like races to the bottom of wage supplementation, in which corporations continue to pay less and less and less as much as they are able to get away from until they hit that bottom line of a minimum wage that is set. And currently within the United States, we have set that way below the living minimum wage of $15 an hour, but it also leads toward political unrest, because with the growing welfare state, you get more more and more pushback from the right wanting to cut down this welfare spending on the impoverished, and then this leads toward massive negative effects for the poor, because now not only do they not have a living minimum wage, but then they're also getting cuts out of this government subsidization of like housing and of food and of different programs which they need in order to live. So then you start getting pushback and cuts within those programs, so you have a much worse situation created for the poor if you don't have both policies implemented together. So simply subsidizing workers through tax policy is not only fiscally irresponsible, but it's also unsustainable in the long term when you're not implementing it along with a minimum wage. So let's go to some of the arguments for a $15 minimum wage, both on like a baseline economic view, and then also let's look at practical implementation and see how it's worked in the real world and why it would work if implemented in 2020. So the baseline economic argument is laid out very succinctly by Robert Reich, and essentially what he explains is that by having a $15 minimum wage, you're forcing companies to pull from capital and from like CEO salaries or shareholders' salaries, which I know Destiny railed against as like, oh, this doesn't really demonstrate anything. You're just like attacking a paper tiger, essentially, that you're not going to actually get any good policy out of this.
Like this idea that like a CEO should make 1,000 times more than employee. Why? Why not? What's the number? What should it be or what shouldn't it be? You don't understand. They're making all that money doing nothing because they're just stealing from the labor. Like the fuck, dude? Come on. You have to have a non-fucking dipshit argument than that. Come on, dude.
But the reason why that money is better distributed to the hands of the workers is because they spend about 182% of their income versus the rich class, who essentially spend 62% of their income. And so this disparity in expenditure is why it's very economically sustainable to raise the minimum wage above what the market would dictate. Because whenever you have a higher minimum wage, you're going to have these workers being able to spend a much larger percentage of their income than the rich are. So this money is not going to be spent on things like it's not going to go into some like savings account and never be seen again within the economy as a large percentage of wealthy profits go. It's instead going to be pumped back into the economy through purchases within the consumer industry. And so this is going to then lead toward these companies making higher profits, which then further allows them to continue paying the minimum wage. So by implementing it, you're raising corporation profit, and thus you're allowing for sustainable models in which they're able to pay this minimum wage, benefiting everyone across the board. And that's why historically minimum wages have worked within the United States. So Ben Zipperer from the Economic Policy Institute builds upon the work of Robert Reich, the American economist I referenced earlier, and explains why a $15 hour minimum wage makes sense as the bar. Because within the 1960s in America, if we adjusted the minimum wage then for inflation and worker productivity, would actually be at about $20 an hour in 2020. And so $15 an hour minimum wage is actually below what we could theoretically raise it toward, and what studies have shown would be a sustainable model, and what has historically been shown to be a sustainable model that will work. So referencing the study done by Ben Zipperer in the Economic Policy Institute, he explains that the bulk of recent economic research on the minimum wage, as well as the best scholarship, establishes that prior increases have had little to no negative consequences and instead have meaningfully raised the pay of low-wage workers. And so within this EPI study, they used a family budget calculator in order to determine the amount that each family would need in order to earn every year in order to pay for housing, food, transportation, childcare, healthcare, taxes, and other necessities. And they found that for a minimum wage increase to $15 by 2024, about 91% of workers receiving wage increases would be age 20 or older, and 68% would be at least of age 25, and that the typical worker in a family who will benefit from this minimum wage increase is actually the family breadwinner, earning an average of about 52% of their family's total income, and that by raising it to $15 an hour, they are going to be able to meet all of their basic necessity needs without the need for government welfare programs that could be much better put toward other uses, such as implementing stuff like single payer healthcare, such as implementing stuff like free college for free public college for Americans, programs that will substantially benefit Americans, and programs that Destiny is in support of. And these workers are actually generally adults and are also disproportionately women and people of color. So we're impacting mostly adults with families, and we're also impacting generally marginalized people with this policy in a massively beneficial way. And so the economy's capacity in order to deliver these higher wages has essentially doubled in the last 50 years since we had a much higher minimum wage within the 1960s. And that that's how they're able to calculate that if the minimum wage had kept pace with labor productivity growth and inflation since 1968, it would be more than $20 per hour now. So Paul Wolfson and Dale Belman reviewed 15 years of research published since 2001, which comprised 37 studies and 739 estimates, and they found that an average estimated employment effect of minimum wage increases was very small, and they conclude within the study that no support for the proposition that the minimum wage has had an important effect on U.S. employment. So this is not going to be affecting employment, but rather, as Doruk Cengiz explains along with colleagues, in all major state-level minimum wage increases between 1979 and 2016, they found significantly raised wages were able to be achieved without reducing the employment of low-wage workers. And notably, they found that the same positive outcomes were even had for the highest minimum wages within the study. So this, compounded with other studies that showed that since 1960, significantly raising the wages have not impacted employment, simply bears out that baseline economic argument I laid out before, that whenever you raise the minimum wage, you're not going to see cuts in employment, because what you're going to see is corporations be able to make more profit from the increased wages, from increased worker expenditures, who are spending that money at a much higher rate than the wealthy would be spending it, thus spurring the economy and leading toward the ability to actually pay these wages. So you're not going to see this sliding scale of government substitution making up for companies continually lowering the wage. Rather, you're going to see a baseline met that benefits the economy, and then you allow the welfare state to take it from there and be able to supplement people's needs where they fall, supplement unemployment benefits, and be able to pay much more to other programs such as healthcare, such as education, without having to pay for corporations' unwillingness to give people a basic living wage. And so all these economic arguments, which are mostly agreed upon by most modern economists, is why the Center for Budget Policy advocates for implementing these two injunctions, both negative tax rates in which you're able to support people who need it, along with a living wage, because they describe them as the twin pillars of making work pay for families that earn low wages, and that together they boost income, widen the path to the middle class, and reduce the gap between high and low income households, and that each supports families and individuals that the other doesn't reach. For example, EITCs, the essential payouts to families who are not able to meet certain needs, primarily target low-income families with children, and are available to working families earning up to more than 3.5 times a full-time minimum wage, while workers' annual salary of $14,500, while the minimum wage, in contrast, targets the very lowest wage workers, regardless of factors like total family income, family status, or age. So you're able to impact multiple different communities with overlap, but you're able to overall pave a way toward the middle class and pave a way for upward mobility for the most impoverished within this country, which is ultimately the goal of all of these policies. And that this has been successfully implemented within multiple states within the U.S. already, where they don't necessarily have a living wage, but increases within the minimum wage along with these negative tax policies in Massachusetts, Oregon, Rhode Island, Maryland, Minnesota, Louisiana, Vermont, and California have had economic success and have been able to tangibly benefit those communities. So overall, when we're looking at this argument, I think it's really important to not take this mentality of, oh, it's going to be intellectually honest to just take a centrist position on this and say, well, I think the minimum wage is going too far because I like capitalism, but also we should tax the rich because capitalism's kind of broken in the way it creates massive wealth and inequality. I think it's really important to push for all of these sensible policies that have economic backing and reasoning behind them, because like anything that we're able to get through with one side of the political spectrum essentially advocating against worker rights and advocating against these policies and advocating for the upper class, anything that's able to get through that can benefit these workers is going to be good and is going to be a step in the right direction. And so there's no reason to move toward the center on these issues. There are solid economic arguments to stay as far to the left on these as possible in order to try to move policy in the right direction.
But now here comes the post. Destiny would literally rather have Hitler murdering Jews in the streets than kids advocating for wage reform.